the clock. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us, such an enthusiastic crowd. Thank you to Dan Schneider and Matt Schlapp for having myself and the Independent Women's Forum here again this year. We're so happy to be a part of this. We are going to have a little bit shorter panel, so we're going to jump right into it. But I am very excited in the midst of a heated election season that CPAC is still willing to dig down and talk about some really substantive, important issues. And so today we're going to talk about how bad government actually really impacts good businesses that are trying to create jobs and economic growth for all of us. We are going to look at some specific legislation, issues like Dodd-Frank and the Clean Power Plan. How are these things actually keeping us from getting ahead? And then we're going to turn to some solutions, right? Because it wouldn't be a CPAC panel if we didn't leave you with something to go home and think about and hopefully fight for. So here to discuss these critical issues are three fantastic panelists. Steve Forbes really needs no introduction. He has led Forbes magazine since 1990, continues today as chairman and editor-in-chief of Forbes Media. He's the author of the new book, Reviving America. And I have the honor of joining Steve every Saturday morning at 11 on Forbes on Fox. Next to Steve is Dr. Kelly Ward. She is a practicing, lots of fans, practicing physician and former Arizona State Senator who is currently challenging Senator John McCain in the Republican primary in Arizona. And to the right of Dr. Ward is Joshua Wright. He is the former commissioner of the Federal Trade Commission and currently the director of the Global Antitrust Institute at George Mason University. He has published widely on issues related to antitrust law, intellectual property, and consumer protection. And we're going to have a great conversation. Josh, I thought I would start with you so that we could sort of begin at the 30,000-foot level. You know, how do we define bad regulations? Because I'm a mom, I have little children, I want to make sure that they're safe, the food that they eat, I want to make sure we have a clean environment. But how do we make sure that reasonable regulations don't turn into a government takeover of an industry?
Let me sort of split that into two things. My background first is as an economist. And economists like to think about market failure as sort of being a predicate for needing regulation. But you can sort of broaden that out to, I think, sort of more generally applicable terms. It's got to be a problem first before we regulate. And I think I sat at the Federal Trade Commission for the past 3 years, and I think not only watching what our agency did, but sort of across the administrative landscape, you think about things like net neutrality, almost certainly a solution in search of a problem. Much of what the FTC has done in terms of ramping up antitrust enforcement, the CFPB, I think it is increasingly the case that it is becoming the default reflexive idea for regulatory agencies in particular that we can regulate first and find the problem second. And that ends up having all sorts of effects on the prices of the groceries you buy, access to internet, sort of things that we feel at home. And I think that sort of change in the culture of regulation is a really important problem.
Steve, do you want to add to that before we move on? I'm going to cover a lot of things today, but I know that that's an area that you might want to chime in on.
Well, getting to the point you alluded to, major economic crisis, which always justifies regulation, massive regulation. Major economic crises always are caused by government. And there's a world of difference between a reg saying you don't drive drunk, you don't go 100 miles an hour in a school zone, and quite another, the government telling you where to drive, when to drive, and what to drive. And that's the situation we have today. Government is using regulation not only to tax, but also to take over large parts of the American economy, whether it's finance, healthcare, the internet, everything they can get their claws on. And the other thing they do with the regulation is not only regulate, but also loot industries, as we see with the banking industry. They conjure up a problem. They know they only survive on government sufferance, so they pay the billions of dollars for the piggy banks of politicians. And by the way, another thing is they have now, the Constitution said Congress should pass laws. They passed too many. but by have a ratio of 100 to 1. It is regulatory agencies that are legislating in America today with no accountability. And King George III, Louis XIV, King George III is probably wondering, how did I lose the revolution with the country I see today?
Well, so regulations, of course, are only one part of the equation. Another area that I know that we've talked a little bit about is access to capital. And it seems that a challenge for good businesses and for small businesses and big businesses is getting access to that capital. And the Fed has been very active in recent years in terms of manipulating interest rates. Where is that falling into this conversation?
Well, one of the most monstrous agency in this town is not the EPA, but the Federal Reserve, and nobody pays much attention to it. This whole thing of manipulating interest rates, Sabrina, is a form of price controls. If the Federal Reserve announced tomorrow that it was going to regulate the prices of Big Macs to stimulate the economy, lower prices, people would have more money to spend, that would stimulate the economy, people would say you're overstepping the bounds. But when they regulate interest rates, which is critical to companies, especially small businesses, getting access for inventories, credit for inventories, expansion and the like, we don't bat an eyelash when the Federal Reserve manipulates interest rates. And what they've done, in the name of, they don't announce it in terms of big government, but in the last 5 years, because they've crushed interest rates, which is like crushing prices, price controls, interest money's supposed to be free. The old saying in the Soviet Union, health care is free, but you can't get any. In terms of credit, you look at the last 5 years, the growth of credit to government up 37%, corporations 32%, small businesses and households, remember small businesses create the jobs of the innovators, 6%. They're long-term, this is a disease that's going to crush this American economy unless we reform the Fed. Downsizing is a polite word for it. I've got other ideas for the Fed.
Well, we'll shift gears for a minute to the area of healthcare, which is affecting us all at the individual level, but it's also affecting a lot of businesses because, as we know, many businesses are the providers of health insurance for individuals. So, Kelly, I would love your thoughts on how Obamacare is now, really putting a lot of businesses at risk, and specifically, what does that look like?
Yeah, well, as a practicing physician, I understand that Obamacare is the biggest takeover of healthcare liberty and freedom that we are ever going to see in our lifetimes. Not just for my profession, but for all of us as patients. And we've got to repeal Obamacare. I'm sorry. It's affecting small businesses because I think they were misled at the beginning. We were told, it's not going to affect businesses under 100, under 50, but those regulations are coming into being now, and it's driving down wages in the least, right. But it is also decreasing the amount of jobs that are available, and that's just terrible for the engine that drives our economy, small business.
And this is a function of this minimum essential requirement, right? That insurance has to cover a certain number of treatments and procedures, and so they simply is too expensive. Right,
yes, so our businesses are being told that they have to purchase something, and they're not given very many choices about what they can purchase. And depending on what kind of employees they have, if they have an older workforce, it's going to cost them immeasurably more than if they have a younger workforce. And so right now we're basing that insurance on where people live, how old they are, and if they smoke. It doesn't talk anything about what their health status is, and so that is a complete shift in the way we've done insurance products in the past. And so it's very bad for small businesses because they simply can't afford it.
How much of your time do you spend filling out forms instead of practicing medicine?
Way too much. I mean, I feel like I'm a data entry clerk.
Well, it seems like when we think about healthcare now, I actually think of this sort of almost like a trust between the government and the health insurance companies. Josh, where does the issue of antitrust fall into all of this in terms of spurring economic growth?
In a couple of ways. Again, I went back to George Mason about 6 months ago, but the last 3 years I was at one of the primary antitrust regulators in the country. What we do all day is sort of begin with the fundamental premise that most economists, hopefully all, believe in, that competition really works for translating into benefits for consumers and sort of lower prices and higher quality. And to sit at an agency like that operates under that premise and then watch sort of a giant monstrosity of a piece of legislation that insulates the entire industry from competition, is sort of hard to swallow. But there's another place where antitrust, I think, and competition issues more generally really matters. It's as bad as Obamacare is, and it's awful. It's not just that. It's also other regulations from other federal agencies, state and local regulations, that create barriers to entry. You can't do dental hygiene work in the state of North Carolina. You can't clean teeth until you've got 200 hours of supervisory credit because a state board of dentists said you can't enter.
And can I ask, why can't we rely on sort of organizations outside of the government who can give a stamp of approval? Because of course we want to make sure that people understand they want to go to an exercise class or they want to get something done and they want to make sure that that person is certified in a way, right? And that's what you're talking about with this sort of licensing regimen that people go through. It's a tremendous barrier to entry for people who want to break into the business world. But how do we also make sure that the consumer is protected? Is there an alternative?
Sure, and it's the worst sort of barrier to entry. Right? Sometimes in the antitrust world, it is giant mergers of billion dollar corporations, and maybe life's a little bit harder because the state's regulated, but they can pocket the expense. Now we'll all pay for it in higher prices, and it's bad. But what we're really talking about oftentimes at the state and local level with some of these regulations is the ability for a small business or an individual to compete in the profession of their choosing, to be a barber, to clean teeth, to provide nursing services, where we've got anti-competitive regulations that sort of kick in. Now, there's a couple ways, we talk a little bit about solutions. Some of these certifications really do work because the regulations are all passed in the name of quality. They often have nothing to do with it. Right. But the people who are entering the industry make promises about the levels of quality that they're going to provide. And we have good old-fashioned state fraud law that governs these things. We don't need layers and layers of federal government regulation on top of that to let people operate as a barber in the locality in which they live.
Did the FTC ever consider, I know what the answer is, doing an antitrust suit against states that have these certificates of needs to set up a healthcare facility so you get real competition? I mean, Starbucks does not need a certificate of need if it wants to compete against Dunkin' Donuts in a town. They just go do it and see which one does better.
Yeah, that's right. And to tell you the truth, I mean, the FTC historically really has actually, to give credit to a federal agency for once during the 40 minutes, has been on the right side of this historically. They have sued. The North Carolina dental example I used, they went in and sued the dentist and they won. With respect to hospital certificate of need laws, my own view, and I shared it at the commission was there, is we should be active in more suits. In the 80s, taxi cab regulations that did things sort of the equivalent of keeping Uber out now, back in the 80s. The Federal Trade Commission went in and sued state taxi cab commissions. I think, in large part, the FTC has sort of left that part of its docket alone and walked away from it. I think that's very bad. You talk about a consumer protection agency, those are the areas where it's really middle class and poor consumers that are getting hit. That really would give great bang for your buck for the agency's dollars. I think they've walked away from that too far, but historically they've...
Is that political lobbying or what?
In the case of the taxi unions, you bet. It's political lobbying. In some cases, it's because the agencies want to bring big, sexy cases. If why bring the NC Dental case when you can sue Google or Apple or Facebook? I think is the attitude often of the agencies. It's a perverse attitude because you're suing where all the jobs are. But I think it is, in some extent, the sort of culture that's inside the agencies now.
You touch on this issue of the sharing economy when you talk about Uber, we think about Airbnb or this new food sharing company, Josephine. How is sort of the regulatory state going to prevent some of these companies from growing, or where are some of the success stories? Because once again, I think people want to make sure that they're safe when they're driving with somebody, but at the same time, we want competition. We know that this is going to drive down prices, it's going to increase efficiency, it's going to give us more choices. That's what conservatives believe in, right?
I think Uber and Lyft and those sorts of ride-sharing companies are a great example. I sort of raised those ones because there have been a lot of studies about the effect of what happens when Uber comes to town or when it is excluded. And the results are pretty easy to predict. Prices come down, all of the things that we believe in about competition that are in every Econ 101 textbook in the land, and probably the Econ 1 textbook too, are right.
Right.
Competition drives down prices. It increases quality. And it has, in the case of Uber and sort of taxi regulations, there are neighborhoods that the taxis won't go to.
Nope.
Raising, having prices signal for drivers to come there. This is the way that markets work. I think in those industries in particular, we've seen a wave of state regulations to keep them out, and I think we're in the middle of that battle, which is why, in part, it sort of depends so much on either the changing the culture inside the agencies or winning those fights other ways.
And Kelly, you've been in the middle of some of this in Arizona, isn't that right?
Well, yes, well, with Uber, but also in Arizona, we had a move by some big guys to try to keep some of the little guys down. It was in the microbrewery industry. One of the only industries that was able to grow throughout the last 10 years, throughout the recession period, and to thrive. And there were some that wanted to push them down and keep them from producing and keep them from being competitive, not only in Arizona, but in the United States and across the country. And we were able to stop that in Arizona because I want the regulations to be lifted from the heads of small businesses so that they're able to thrive. So the government just needs to stay out of the way.
By the way, the example of Uber, Lyft, and others demonstrates that when free markets are allowed to operate, they always turn luxuries into commodities. Once upon a time, only the rich could have chauffeurs and cars on call. Now everyone has them, thanks to Uber.
That's right. Well, as we're thinking about sort of how this affects us at the individual level, I'd like to stay sort of in the trenches here. I think one of the things that we're going to hear a lot from Hillary this fall is about labor regulations. And so often they're framed as helping employees, and especially very often in terms of helping women, but things like raising the minimum wage, mandating paid leave benefits, these often have backfiring impacts. I'm happy to chime in on that, but I would love to hear from the panel on sort of what is sort of the bottom line with all of these labor regulations? What is it doing to the economy? How is it impacting people here?
Well, in the name of helping people, it destroys people who are starting out. The minimum wage is a killer for people who have no skills, want to go in the workforce, move their way up. Research has shown just on minimum wage that within a year, you're earning above the minimum wage because you're starting to get skills, you learn to come on time, work with your colleagues, you're starting to contribute something. So with this call it $15,000 an hour, why not? We can all get rich. But what it does is destroy that, also hurts small businesses. Now, when you're a big profitable company like Google, you can offer free jelly beans and everything else. But if you're a small business with small margins, it's quite another thing. It prevents small companies from becoming big companies and provide more benefits. So if you strangle small, you don't get the big. And by the way, one of the big advantages this country has had until recently is one reason why we always grew faster than other developed countries in Europe and elsewhere is because we always created new big companies each and every generation, 50 to 75 multi-billion-dollar companies. So we don't get stagnant. Apple was small in the 70s, now a big giant. And with these regulations over time, you do what you do in Europe. The incumbents, they stay forever. The new get crushed or bought out, and you have the stagnation that you have in Europe, which leads to ugly politics. We don't need that here.
Well, and as a woman who has owned a business, I understand a small business, a medical practice. I understand the impact of what a minimum wage law would have had on our business. We wouldn't have been able to have the employees that were necessary to fulfill the government regulations that were heaped upon us. And in terms of mandatory leave, it also does not take into account the effect on the business owner, not whatsoever. And many of the people who are touting it, people like Bernie Sanders and people like Hillary Clinton, have no regard for the people that own the business, and they're selling their populist message to a group of people who are willing to buy it, but don't understand the cost that they're putting in.
Right, and I think I speak for everyone in this room when I say we don't want a go-it-alone society. We want to help those people who are truly in need, but we can imagine how big businesses that can use these kind of mandates to really crush their competition, right? I think that's sometimes what's going to happen. And the little hardware store that can't afford to provide that Washington mandated paid leave, very extensive paid leave time, is going to go out of business.
Right, and especially in rural America where those small businesses are the only businesses. And so then there are no jobs. And then we wonder why so many people are on welfare and on food stamps and needing government assistance, because we have regulated the businesses that were there to make those excellent jobs for the people that live there extinct.
Another thing that I think is impacting businesses, certainly, and sometimes I think it's hard for people to sort of realize how all the dots are connected, but is energy prices, right? And our Washington's sort of intervention into the energy sector, most recently with the Clean Power Plan. I know, Kelly, in Arizona, you're feeling the impact of this, and we are a very big country. The idea of a one-size-fits-all sort of regulatory system of our energy system, when every state has different needs, has different resources, it has different economies, it seems crazy to me. How is it affecting you in Arizona?
Well, I don't know about you, but I think everybody on this panel and probably everybody in this room agrees that when you flip the light switch, you want the light to come on. And you want it to come on at in an efficient way and to be cost effective. And if we regulate clean coal technology out of existence, we are not going to have that kind of reliable energy. We're seeing it with our Navajo generating station in Arizona. The federal regulators are coming in trying to close that plant. Arizona has a plan for that plant because it not only supplies power to a large part of Arizona, it also supplies water to Phoenix and to Tucson. And so, we need water and we need power. And so we need the federal government to step back and let our state level agencies do the limited regulation that needs to be done in our energy sector.
So is the answer, Steve, that the government should just get out of the energy industry altogether?
Yes, it'll do fine. And you talk about energy. Germany bought the Gore fantasy, the Al Gore religion, and went all to alternate energy, spent hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars. Their energy costs today are 3 times for electricity as it is in the United States, which is why companies are coming over here, because we allowed free markets, not on federal government lands, which Obama blocked, but thanks to real entrepreneurs in energy, we're now a cheap energy nation. That was not done by Bernie Sanders. That was done by people out in the energy patch.
So we've spent a lot of time at this panel talking about the regulatory state. Maybe we can shift gears for a minute and think about the other side of the balance sheet, which is taxes, right? Certainly, I come from a family with lots of small businesses. You spend a lot of time filing taxes and keeping papers straight for taxes. We don't have lots of expensive accountants to do all of that for us. Where does that fall into this entire conversation? Because it's not just the regulatory state.
Well, it's a burden. You all know that taxation is a burden, not just collecting revenue for government, but it's a burden. The IRS estimates, for example, we spend 6 billion hours a year filling out tax forms. The experts estimate we spend $200 to $300 billion a year complying with the tax code. That's why we got to just junk the tax code. Remember, it's not just about marginal tax rates and the like. It's a moral issue, Sabrina. Imagine if you take the last 20 years, if you'd taken all those tens of billions of hours filling out tax forms, the literally trillions of dollars complying with a dead-end, corrupt, complex tax code, incomprehensible, the immense brain power that now is applied to this whole area, and imagine if that had been applied to new products, new services, new medicines, new medical devices, how much better and richer life would be for all. So these people like Bernie Sanders who say, I want to help the people, good, step back and let the people help themselves, because when your success is other people's success.
I think one of the points that Steve makes, well, I'm not going to out-tax Steve, that's not going to happen. But I think the point really does connect to this larger trend. I mean, Steve points out much of the burden of the regulatory system. Let it operate for a while and see where the burden falls. And it falls on people filling out their taxes. It falls on small businesses. But if you connect that sort of particular set of dots across net neutrality. Large companies lobby for internet regulation that keeps small entrants out. The burden is imposed on consumers, one, as higher prices get passed on, but also small businesses that want to compete. The CFPB, large banks will be fine. They can handle the cost of compliance. Small banks that want to enter are excluded.
Right.
Across the board, I think sort of connecting those dots. And this is something that I think, my second Econ 101 reference of the day, I'm an econ professor, so forgive me, but in Econ 101, we used to know where regulatory burdens hit. We used to understand it was conventional wisdom, and I think we need a re-education course on conventional wisdom about regulation.
Yeah, and I bet, Kelly, you have some thoughts on
Well,
Arizona in terms of, I mean, a pretty
Yes,
conservative
well,
state.
we have got to reform the tax code. I like a lot of the presidential ideas that are out there, a fair, flatter kind of tax across the board, getting that corporate tax rate down to something that is reasonable so that people can come into this country, businesses can come into this country and provide the wonderful jobs that our citizens are crying out for. We've got to do that if we want our economy to continue to grow. We've got to get out of the Obama doldrums, and we've got to get into the conservative heyday.
So that we allow businesses to invest that money where they know makes sense rather than giving it to government to throw spaghetti at the wall and hope that it sticks.
Exactly.
Right.
Well, in Kelly's area, how about nationwide shopping for health insurance?
Yes.
Interstate Commerce Clause to health insurance.
You're exactly right.
So you get hundreds of companies competing for your business. We want competition
And
instead
even
of these statewide cartels.
Even in conservative Arizona, I was unable to get that through. I sponsored it last year, and I got it through the Senate, but I couldn't get it heard in the House. And I think that was because of the strength of the insurance lobby on that side of the legislature in Arizona. So.
Well, you're beginning to touch on solutions, and I'm thinking we have less than 5 minutes of our panel. We've had a lot of candidates coming through these doors the last couple of days. What are the one or two things that you would tell them this has to happen in your first 100 days in office to make this economy get back on track? You want to start?
I spent 3 years at the Federal Trade Commission. I'm an antitrust guy, so I've got a hammer and all the things are nails, so I'm going to talk a little bit about antitrust and regulation from that perspective. There are two things that I think sort of scream out for attention. The first thing is that across the regulatory state, you have a rise of regulations that are being promulgated by agencies, not through Congress, broad delegations of powers to agencies, and nobody's watching.
Right. No accountability, right?
Nobody's watching. Occasionally, the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals will strike one down here, they'll strike one down there, they get another crack at net neutrality soon. But across the board, I think there's not enough oversight of the agencies, no cost-benefit analysis of regulations in any meaningful way. And I think occasionally Congress has looked at that issue from time to time, but there's been no momentum. I think that has to change.
Right.
The second thing, and I'll be brief, is I think in the antitrust world, so to go back 30 years ago, there were 4 or 5 antitrust agencies around the world. There are 130 now.
Wow.
China, Korea, Japan, Taiwan, including and the US and the EU. It used to be the case. And it really matters when there is a merger. It is a global merger. When there, this is Google and Apple and Facebook and so forth. The global antitrust community used to be led by the United States. There is protectionist, nationalist use of antitrust laws by other countries, and now increasingly, instead of the U.S. taking the intellectual leadership in the world to say, stop that, like so many other areas, we sort of joined the party.
Right.
And I think that is, it's inside the antitrust sort of weeds, but in terms of dollar for dollar paycheck and the price of the goods and services you pay for, I think it really matters.
That's what's affecting us. Kelly, real quickly.
Real
what
quick,
would
I'm
you
just going to say
recommend?
one thing. Repeal Obamacare, get the free market back in, get competition back in to save our exceptional healthcare system in this country.
And 2 quick things. You hit one of them, I'll hit 2 others. One is junk the tax code, bury it. The EPA may not allow it to be buried because it's so toxic. Put in a simple flat tax,
Yes.
And with the Federal Reserve, which people don't pay enough attention to, stable dollar, Fed gets downsized to this, and we have what we had for 180 years. Sounds strange today, but it worked. A dollar linked to gold. I'd rather trust that than Washington politicians.
Well, I think we know where to come for the solutions now. We've got it all wrapped up right here. I hope that you have time to mingle and see the rest of the exhibits and listen to the next speakers. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great.